Today we're going to dig into the element of art value. As you learned in Art 1, there are 6 different elements of art. There's line, value, color, shape and form, space, texture. But today with value, we're talking about the lightness or darkness of a color. Every color has a light or dark value. You can see it when you squint your eyes at it and kind of eliminate some of that color. But value is one of the most important things that you can have in any of your artworks. So if you're interested in drawing or painting in particular, having contrast, the difference between light and dark, is really important. Value deals directly with light. It's the way that the light reflects and bounces off of objects and goes into our eyes. And it's what we are going to be using on a 2-dimensional form to help create the illusion of a 3-dimensional object. Take this apple for example. What I want you to do is I want you to squint your eyes, so close them most of the way and look at them. And while, yeah, you're still going to be seeing the color red with that apple that's on the left, it's going to simplify it down into just values. Okay. And if we lose the color red, we still have the idea that, yes, this is an apple. Okay, we could take it a step further and we could block it out, similar to what we did if you took Art 1 last year, what we did with those portraits that we painted. And we segment it, we posterize it down into specific values. Okay, and it's still going to come across as an apple. Value isn't just important to drawing, it's important to really any kind of art form that we do. And it's going to allow us to see form. Okay, so you have shape, and shape would be like a circle or a square, and form would be a sphere, so like a round basketball or tennis ball or a cube. Okay, something that appears 3-dimensional. Okay, and for us to see form, we have to have light. Okay, what I want you to do is I want you to look around the room right now, and specifically looking at our black desks that we're working on. Okay. Yes, the top of that desk is completely black, but when we have that light on, there's going to be kind of 3 different values. There's going to be the highlight, those lighter areas that are bouncing off the top of the table. There's going to be the side plane, and then there's going to be that underside, or maybe a different side, a different angle that isn't catching the light as well, and that's going to be our shadow. Okay. Those 3 different values, even if they're just simplified, are what's going to change it from looking like something that's very flat into something that's looking 3-dimensional. Okay, so you can see in this charcoal drawing of a still life, there's a full range of value, and those full range of values helps create the illusion that this isn't just like a cutout cup or a cutout little bowl with these flat little flowers in it. Instead, each of these little petals kind of have their own different values, and then there's even shadows being cast onto different objects that are also helping that 3-dimensional form. So when we talk about value, you're going to hear us talk about the grayscale or the value scale all the time. And really what the value scale is it's like your visual alphabet. Okay, it's what you're going to be using to create form. Okay, it's what you're going to use to help yourself, help your eyes evaluate what you're seeing. Okay, because oftentimes our eyes are going to play tricks on us. One of the projects we're going to be doing is just like a small sketchbook assignment where you're going to be sketching these white teacups. Okay, but really these teacups are not white at all. If you look at them in life, yeah, they're white, but when you're actually sketching them, very little of them are actually white. Only where the light is really hitting it to the most extreme do you see white. And actually, some of them are down into these 6 through 9 values. They're really very dark. Okay. So we're going to be sketching a value scale, and I'm not going to say that it's one of the most fun exercises that we're going to do, but it really is one of the most important exercises for you to do to improve your eyes, okay, to make you a more aware observer. Okay, it's going to be challenging. It's going to require you to be patient. It's going to require you to slow down. And it's also going to require you to learn some new skills. Okay, something that I don't want to see in any of your value scales at all, without exception, is smudging. Okay, instead, what we're going to be really focusing on is we're going to be learning to hatch and crosshatch and hold our pencil correctly, so that way we can create a really nice texture that's really controlled on our piece of paper. It doesn't mean smudging isn't done at all in drawings, but for specifically this value scale, we're going to be using cross hatching. Okay, and we're going to learn how to make a nice even gradation that's stepping like a ladder as we go along. Okay, and again, what I want you to kind of circle back around to is this is like when you are learning a new instrument and you're having to do scales, or when you are playing a sport and your coach is having you do these footwork exercises. Okay, while it may feel that they are not directly connected to what your sport is, they're going to make you better. Okay, your coach knows what they're doing. I promise you, me as a drawing teacher, this is my 10th year teaching drawing, and I have not had a student come back to me ever and say that they wish that they hadn't learned how to crosshatch. Okay, it is time consuming, but I promise you in the end it's going to be worth it. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to grab a ruler. It's up to you if you make it all the way across. I have a pretty big sketchbook. It's about 14 inches. Yours is probably about like an 8.5 by 11-ish size. So what I want you to do is, we're not going to overthink it at all. I just want you to hold down your ruler with one hand and make a line along the top. Just keep it in the same spot. Make a line along the bottom. And then you could even make a line along one of the sides. And what that's going to do is it's going to give us like a nice rectangle size to work with. From here, you could either use your inches and make little marks along the way. And again, whenever you're using a ruler and you're connecting, you want to make sure that there's at least 2 marks. So you're connecting going all the way across. Or what I'm going to do is I am just going to guesstimate. I'm just going to estimate, really. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, if this is my whole length of my value scale, about this spot is about halfway. And then I'm going to take this side and I'm going to divide this up. So, okay, if that's a half, then that means this is a fourth. And that means this is 3/4. I'm going to divide this into 8 sections overall. So I'm just going to kind of guesstimate, and I'm going to end up with spaces that are maybe more square than a rectangle because of how long I decided to make my value scale. And they don't need to be perfect. Ultimately, I care a lot more about the shading that's happening on the inside than I do how it looks. Now you have this extra space. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I would suggest numbering them. And then we are going to have a number 9. And you could add this section to one side or to the other. It just depends on how much extra space you end up having. I knew that this was happening, so I added a little bit of extra space on the end. If you didn't do that and you just took your whole space, just add a little bit extra, like what you're seeing up here in this image. Just I added a little bit to that side. Before we start actually shading, there's going to be a specific way I'd like you to shade. There are some things that I think you need to understand about these pencils that you now have in your possession that are really going to help with your artwork. First thing you need to understand before we start shading, before we start talking about the value scale, is that you really can break up the value scale into 3 different sections. So the first one would be your highlights. And your highlights are going to be your very lightest values. Okay, your very lightest values. So when you think about an image, really anything that is white or very, very close to white would be your highlight. On the flip side of that, you have your shadows. Exactly what it sounds like. It's the exact opposite of highlights. It's your very darkest values. And then everything kind of in between, we're going to call midtones. Now, when you're working with your value scale, You could work with just one pencil and be very careful with that pencil and very specific with that pencil and accomplish a full value range. However, since you have these different tools at your um, hands, it is important to understand how to use them. So at the end of your pencils, and you can see I have just kind of an assortment of different types of pencils. These are the pencils I use for my own artwork, and I kind of like working with different brands, but the different brands all have something in common, which is at the end of them, they all have different labels. So up here, you can see right in the middle, you have an HB pencil. And an HB pencil is like your orange test taking pencil. Okay, it's your number 2 pencil. And what we're going to do is we're going to describe that H is hard. Okay, and your B stands for bold. So, like a very bold, dark mark. Okay, and then the numbers that are associated with those letters really refer to the intensity of it. So, an 8B pencil is darker, it's more intense, it's softer than a 4B pencil. Okay, let's see, I also have a 2B pencil here. On the other side of this, you'll see these very light values. And for that, you have your H pencils. Okay, and your H pencils have a harder piece of graphite inside of them. And the reason that matters is think about like if you are working with a piece of wood that is very hard against a piece of sandpaper. Okay, so you have kind of this zigzaggy mountaintopy kind of thing. And this is what your paper would look like if you cut it transverse. If you saw it sideways under a microscope, it looked like little mountaintops and valleys. And this is called tooth. Okay. And when you're dragging your pencil along that tooth, it's leaving behind graphite. Okay. And so when you have a hard pencil, it's not going to leave behind a whole bunch of graphite as opposed to a soft pencil that's going to leave behind a whole bunch more graphite. Now, since this pencil is leaving behind more graphite, you're going to have to sharpen it more frequently. Typically, you run through these pencils much quicker. I've had these pencils, these H pencils, for forever because they're a harder graphite, so I don't have to sharpen them as often, which is kind of nice. That's part of the reason that you work with an HB pencil for your test taking is because it's going to leave a very bold mark, okay, but it's also very hard, so you're not going to have to sharpen it as frequently. Kind of nifty. Now here, you're going to use those H pencils for the highlights. You're going to use those B pencils, a 4B, a 6B, an 8B pencil for your darkest values. And then kind of here in the middle, you have your HB pencil, so hard but bold pencil. You have just a plain B pencil. And then you also could probably count a 2B pencil for your midtones also. Now, these pencils are really versatile. They're really what you want to be using for sketching rather than trying to sketch with an H pencil or a B pencil. An H pencil is going to damage your paper, and we're going to talk about that later. In its own way, it's kind of hard to erase, even though it's a very light line. Your B pencils with 4B, 6B, 8B are going to be very, very dark marks and sometimes can be difficult to erase. So these mid-tone pencils are really nice because they can give you those value ranges without having one of the extremes. So as we are first starting out, what we're going to do with this value scale is I'm going to have you start with your very darkest value. Okay, we numbered out these sections. You've got 1 through 9, and we're going to start over here at 9. The 9 is going to represent black. Okay, and it's of course not going to be exactly black because it's graphite. It's more of like a really, really, really dark gray. But what we're going to do is we're going to start there. As you're shading this 9 value, you guys don't have an 8B. And the reason you don't have an 8B is the same reason you don't have like a 12H or a 12B. When you get to the extremes of those pencils, the graphite on the inside becomes kind of brittle or soft. And so when you drop a pencil, I don't know if you've ever tried sharpening a pencil and you sharpen it, you get a nice point on it, and then you start using it and it just breaks for no reason. That's because that pencil's been dropped a whole lot. So the pencils that you have, you want to make sure that you have them in a nice safe spot. Maybe get like a little pencil case for them so they're not getting knocked around. But when you push it to these extremes of like an 8B pencil or even my 5H pencil, and again, they go up to the extremes of 12, I would probably not travel a whole lot with those pencils, because what's going to happen is the graphite on the inside is just going to get segmented and then it's going to break and it's going to become very hard to use. So you do have a 6B pencil and you do have a 4B pencil, and this one's actually my favorite. I think it's a really nice versatile pencil. You guys are all going to end up with a favorite pencil, and I think that's just fine. But when we're shading, what I want you to do is I don't want you to just like really, really dig in hard to your paper. Okay. I'm not sure if you can see this, but you're immediately getting this shiny surface and you're really pushing really, really hard down on the paper. Okay. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to build up layers. Okay. This is going to be a more time consuming way to shade, but I promise you, I've never had a student come back to me and say that they wish that they didn't learn how to do this. Okay. Every single student has grown from this, and I promise you it's worth the time investment. So when you're shading, if you want a nice sharp edge, you're going to put the end of your pencil towards that edge. Okay. And I'm going to keep my pencil pretty much on my paper. Okay. And I'm just going to go back and forth, trying to lay down a nice flat value. And we're going to talk about this more in just a second. But really, to get a nice flat value, you want to make sure that your pencil marks are really close together. Okay. If I'm leaving gaps in between my shading, the only way to go and fix that is to go back in and literally touch back in with that same pencil all those little tiny holes, which is even more time consuming and oftentimes more frustrating. Most people just kind of leave it and they're just like, well, whatever. Okay. The other thing is you have a natural range of motion. So I've been going this direction and I have my paper facing up and down. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to change, normally I would change my paper position, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to change my wrist position and I'm going to approach it from a different direction. Okay. And again, I'm going to go with my pencil tip towards that edge, and I'm going to kind of shade away from it. Now you can see I'm not pressing any harder. All I'm doing is I'm just putting down a second layer. And with that second layer, it already has a pretty good value change. You've hopefully established a decently dark value there. You're not going so hard that you're pressing. You probably still see some white speckles in your paper, and that's okay. We're going to talk about why here in just a second. Before we start getting into how to become successful at shading, what I want to do is I first want to set you up with some technique. Now, these are not hard and fast rules. There are times that you're going to want to make marks that are like these, but I'm going to explain when you might want to use those. So the first thing you want to do is you want to use small, random, close together marks whenever you're shading. Okay, and typically you want to shade in the same direction. Okay, you can see my pencil, I'm not really picking it up a whole lot. If I am, I'm trying really hard to make sure that I'm keeping the same amount of pressure at the beginning of my mark as I am at the end of my mark. Some of you may have learned this little technique where you're shading in little tiny circles. Okay, and the reason why you're shading in little tiny circles is you probably had a teacher tell you that. And the reason why your teacher told you that is because oftentimes when we put down our pencil, we press harder at the beginning than we do at the end. And there's like this little wrist flick that happens at the end, and a darker mark that happens at the beginning. Okay. And so that's the reason that they're having you do these circles, is they're trying to prevent you from picking up your pencil so that you don't get this wrist flick. Okay. If you do want to work with circles, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But you want to make sure that those circles are so tight together that they don't really have these centers. Okay. Because if they have these centers, they're going to, your shading is going to look kind of furry, which, you know, if you're doing a tennis ball is great. But if you're trying to create a really smooth table, maybe is not the best technique. Okay. But if you keep your pencil marks super close together to the point that you're not really seeing any kind of center in them at all, this is not a bad technique to do. Okay. Another thing, this middle one, oftentimes when we're shading, and we're shading really quickly, we're shading with lines. And when we're shading with these lines and we're overlapping them, you can see these kind of darker sections here. The reason why that's happening is because with every single time that you lay down a value, so we have one layer of shading here. Let's see what happens when I layer down another layer of shading. Okay, and I'm not pressing any harder than I was before. Okay, but you can see that this area, maybe a little bit better, that this area is darker than this. Okay, so now if I add like a third line to it, you can see that again, like this had one layer, this has two layers, and now this has three layers. And with every single one of those, it's getting darker. I should get the glare off that better. There we go. With every single one of those, it's getting darker. So when we look at this, the reason why this area is lighter than this area is because when we're going across with these lines, there's an overlap that's happening right here. And the way that you do go back and fix it is you say, okay, this area is darker and that area is darker and this area is lighter. Well, how do I make something darker? Well, I can add another layer. Okay, so you can go back in and you can kind of touch back up that little area and kind of even out that shading. Now, if that's too dark, you also could go in with your kneadable eraser, which we'll talk about probably another lesson. Okay, so that's how you would even that out. Now, the last thing is smudging. Okay, and smudging is something that I want you to use very specifically. Okay, there is definitely a time and a place for smudging, but what I do not want is for you to smudge your entire drawing. Okay, I do not want you to smudge an area that is your focal point, that is like the most important area of your drawing. Okay, we're going to learn to embrace texture in this class. Texture is going to add to your drawings, it's going to help your drawings. And when you smudge, what's going to end up happening is you if you do it correctly, you're going to create a very, very smooth space. Okay, a very flat space. And we don't really want flatness in the foreground and the interest areas of our drawings. However, if you're wanting something to kind of blend out into a background, which we'll do on our teacup drawings, we'll smudge the background or maybe the edges of a shadow. Those would be excellent times to use that technique. Okay, but the reason that I have such a issue with smudging is because oftentimes people use it instead of good shading. Okay, so they do, you know, this type of shading, you know, little tiny circles, or they go really, really quick with their shading. And then they just take their finger, and first off, don't use your finger. Okay, your finger has oils on it, and you're going to embed it into your paper. And then, you know, one of these times that you touch your face and then you touch your paper, you're going to end up with this little oil spot, and you're going to find that it is not only going to have different texture and different value, but it's also going to be really almost impossible to erase. Okay, if you're going to smudge, you should use a paper towel or a blending stump, a tortillon instead. Okay, but I'm going to practice bad technique here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do this. Okay. Now, do you see how you can still see my marks? Okay. You can still see my marks underneath that smudging because all I'm doing is I'm taking this graphite and I'm moving it around, but those marks are still there. Okay. Versus if I take my time and I shade nicely, which, yeah, is going to take a little bit more time, and then smudge, and I would even say like maybe do like a circular kind of motion, I'm going to end up with a much better end product. Okay, it's not going to be stripy. It's not going to have little circles underneath. Um, it's going to be a better finished product for me. Okay, but again, I always want to have you hesitate before you smudge. You can always do that later, but it's never going to make up for good technique. Okay, you should always have good technique, and then if you want to, if you need to, then smudge on top of that. Learning about good technique, there are two techniques that I really would like to equip you with. And the first one is called hatching. Okay. And hatching is going to be marks that are going in the same direction at a random rate. Okay. Hatching can look like this, or it could be long lines. Both of these would be hatching. Okay. So the shading that you saw me do before, that was also hatching. Okay. Where I'm keeping my pencil low and close to the paper, and my lines are very close together. Okay. Now, one of the things that I also want you to kind of keep in mind here is you have drawing pencils for a reason. Okay. Check out the end of that pencil compared to the end of a mechanical pencil. Okay, you're going to be able to shade a lot faster and a lot better if you use a drawing pencil than if you use a mechanical pencil. Now, there may be times in your drawings that you're using, very, very fine, small detail that you may want to use a mechanical pencil. Okay, but this mark, this is wide and as thick as that pencil is going to go. Okay, which is maybe more of the equivalent of like working with like the tip of your pencil. Okay, but if I'm using the side of my pencil, so if I'm holding my pencil like what you're seeing in that image up here, okay, I'm holding it about halfway. I'm not pressing down on my paper. I'm really just kind of resting it in my hand. I'm going to get a better angle on this piece of graphite here, and I'm going to be able to make a wider mark. Okay, and a wider mark is going to allow me, here you go, is going to allow me to shade faster. Okay, I'm able to cover more of the paper more quickly. Okay, now you don't want to hold it out so far that you're holding it at the end. You're not going to be able to have any control there. It's just, that's going to be a little silly. But instead, hold it in the middle. Okay, and those of you that are like me, it'll prevent you from pressing so hard. So oftentimes when I'm teaching people to shade, the biggest complaint that I end up hearing is, well, I can't get those lighter values because I press too hard. And I can empathize with that because I also press very hard on my paper. But going back to our mountaintops and valleys here, this is like a transverse view of your paper. So like looking at your paper like that, if it were cut in half. And when you press really hard down onto your paper, what's going to end up happening is you're going to end up flattening out that piece of paper. Okay. And you literally are taking that little mountaintop and you're crushing it down. So then there's graphite layered up down here. Okay. And then you try to go back in with your eraser and erase it. But the problem is that this little mountaintop doesn't exist anymore. Okay, so when you try to shade that area, that's when you end up with something that I call ghost lines. Okay, I'm sure you've had this happen in a drawing where like you're drawing and you erase something, and you try to shade back on top of it, and there's like this little white halo that's around the mark that you did. And it's because you pressed really hard that you literally left an indent in your paper, and there's nothing you can do. Okay. The only thing that you can do is, really sharpen your pencil, maybe even get a mechanical pencil and shade down into that little divot until it matches the area that's around it. Okay. So you really want to make sure that you're holding your pencil back a little bit further, that you're not white knuckling it. Again, when I write, I'm one of those people that holds it up here and I literally get white knuckles and I'm pressing so hard that you can see echoes of my writing down through multiple pieces of paper. Okay. But when I'm drawing, I readjust where I'm holding my pencil and so that I have more control. Okay. So you want to readjust where your hand is so you're not pressing. Okay. You want to be very specific about when you press with your artwork. And then you want to think about what types of marks you're making. Okay. So hatching is your first step towards really good shading. But what will really level it up is cross hatching. So cross hatching is exactly what it sounds like. Okay. It's taking lots of little marks in a random way and then crossing them. Now, we'll talk about this later in the semester, but you can leave your marks very visible. We could also put these closer together so that you don't have this white paper showing through. This would be like a close up on shading. We don't really want this texture for our shading. This is just kind of for an example. Okay, but we could do longer marks. And again, if we keep them closer together, then you end up with smoother shading. But this is also this is also hatching. And then we turn it into cross hatching when we add a second layer going a different direction onto it. Okay. What we don't want to do is we don't want to make kind of this little window pane kind of thing, because what's going to end up happening is these little areas in here are going to be really, 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 really hard to shade back in. Okay. Things I want you to think about when we are learning to make something darker is there's 3 different ways to do it. We can layer, like what we saw up here. Okay. We can layer. More layers is going to be darker. We can change our pencils. So we can change from like a 2B to a 4B or 6B, or to a lighter pencil, an H pencil, or we can press harder. But pressing harder is always going to be the last resort, because as soon as we start pressing harder, we're literally changing the texture of our paper, and there's not an undo for that. So we want to be really careful about that. Our third step, now that we have a background of cross hatching, is going to be to darken our black. So I'm going to be using my 6B pencil again. And what I want you to do is in a corner, keeping in mind the 3 ways to make something darker. Okay, we can change pencils. We're using our darkest pencils for a 6B pencil. We can layer. So I spent time going over the same spot here again and again and again. And then also maybe adding a little bit of pressure. I want you to wait before you add pressure to it though, okay? Because I don't want us to wreck our paper. But you can see now that I've added like a really dark black corner, all of a sudden the rest of it looks really light. So I'm going to spend some time here cross hatching, going in lots of different directions until I'm not really seeing any speckled white left in this space. I want you to also kind of keep in mind the little mountaintops and valleys. So if you're only shading ever in one direction, you're really only ever going to hit that side of the mountain top. Okay, and what I want you to do is you have that full range of motion here in your wrist, and I want you to change either the direction of your paper, which is what I would suggest doing, or the direction of your wrist, so that way you can cross hatch naturally without having to like torque your wrist and make it feel a little bit uncomfortable. And you can also keep the edge of your pencil towards that line. At this point, I'm starting to add a little bit more pressure to it. I'm definitely staying in the same spot longer. Trying to get really nice edges. I still have white speckles here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and crosshatch again. I'm going to change directions. See, I'm holding down further on my pencil so I can add a little bit more pressure. Each layer, I'm trying to be very consistent about the direction that I'm shading. Okay, I think I've got a pretty good black here. Not really seeing any speckles in here. I don't feel like as I'm going across it, it's getting any darker. I was pressing harder. I was staying in the same spot for longer. It has a shiny appearance, which means it's burnished, which means I'm really kind of pressing down my paper. I'm filling up those little valleys in between the mountains with graphite until there's really just not any more space for that paper to accept anything more. Now that we've done that, we're going to do our number 5 value. Remember, our number 5 is a midtone. And so you have the choice of, you could work with a B, you could work with an HB, you could work with a 2B pencil. And really any of these are appropriate. It just kind of depends on how hard you press. So if you have a very light touch, I would suggest maybe sketching with the 2B pencil. If you tend to draw very hard, maybe do your HB pencil. This is not technically a drawing pencil, so I'm not going to use it. I'm going to use my B pencil. And what I want you to keep in mind for the rest of these is I want them to be lighter than what you think they need to be. Okay, it's always going to be easier to go back and make something darker, and I'm going to show you how to do that. But we want to be careful to make something lighter instead of darker. It didn't record.
That's a funny way you said that. It didn't. Well, got a little bit of bracing to do after Bill.
Good deal. He's sleeping, so if you could be really quiet.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
And I'm recording.
Right now.
Yep. Thank you. So as I'm shading this one, I want to make sure I'm not holding down close to the end like I was before. I don't want to add pressure down on my piece of paper. I don't want to hold it all the way back. I want to hold it somewhere in the middle. And something else to keep in mind is I want to be very careful to not get graphite on the side of my hand. Okay, so if you've rubbed your hand and you've gotten graphite on it, the first thing I suggest doing is going and washing your hand. And then the other thing you should do is you should just go get a piece of computer paper and put it over the rest of your drawing and rest your hand on it. So that way when you're moving your hand, you're not rubbing it across your graphite. So right now you might see that there are some kind of patches that are a little bit lighter and a little bit darker. I would suggest fixing those as you go along. If you wait to do those later, they're going to be harder to evaluate and they're going to be harder to fix. And I'm going to go back in, I'm going to cross hatch. I'm going to put my pencil tip towards the edge. And what I'm doing here is I'm really guesstimating what do I think is a happy medium between white and black. You're probably not going to get this value correct on your first try. You're probably going to need to make an adjustment. It's going to be easier for that adjustment to make it darker than it will be to try to make it lighter. You can go back in with your kneadable eraser and kind of touch it back. But I would suggest erring on the side of a little bit too light so that way you can go back in and just make it darker later, and I'll show you how to do that. So now that you have this middle value, what we're going to do is we're going to do these lighter values first, which means you're going to need to change your pencil. You're going to need to change it to your lightest pencil, which is going to be an H. And we're going to start here on this number 2 value. Remember, this one is white. It's basically your free square. Okay, so as you're doing this one, the lighter values are going to be tougher because you're not going to be able to do as much cross hatching to smooth out your values and to make a nice smooth texture. And so what I want you to do is to make sure that you're holding your pencil out a little bit further. I have a shorter pencil, so it looks like I'm holding it out further. But really, I just don't want you to be pressing down. Okay, I just want the weight of the pencil to be moving across the surface really super lightly. Your goal here with this number 2 is to make it just barely not white. You're going to find in really any art form, one of the hardest parts is to just get started. And so what I want you to do is get your values down, and then we can go back and we can make adjustments to it. Learning how to make adjustments to your artwork is super important. You want to make sure that you're always open to that. The chances of you being perfect from the very start is a really high expectation to have for yourself. So my shading is a little splotchy. So what I'm doing before I cross hatch is I'm going to go and kind of start to touch back in some of those areas. I'm going to cross hatch and go in a different direction. And again, with this lightest value, you got to be very specific. Okay, don't press hard. Keep your marks random and small. Try to keep your pencil very close to the paper. Try not to lift it up a whole bunch. Have a very loose, light grip on your paper, on your pencil. And most importantly, keep your marks really, really close together. You're probably just going to be able to get 2 layers of cross hatching. Okay. Now for these 2, you really are going to be guesstimating what you think is going to be the right answer. So what I would do is start with this one. Okay, and again, I'm going to place on top of this a piece of paper so that I don't smudge it with my hand. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this edge. And I'm going to start with a value that I think is at least this value, but hopefully a little bit darker. I'm not really pressing. I would say that, that second one, I wasn't I was hardly even holding the pencil down against the piece of paper, so there maybe is a little bit more pressure. But mostly what I'm doing is I'm just staying in the same spot for longer. And what that's really allowing me to do is it's actually really allowing me to kind of fill in those kind of in-between spaces. Now you're going to have a tendency to want to just go from one side to the other and knock this thing out super quickly. While yes, you could do that and it will turn out looking just fine. You're not really practicing good technique because eventually you're going to be working in a space that's bigger than just this little square. And you're going to need to know how to shade that without it being stripy and with having really good technique. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, that if you're going from like one side to another for the whole thing, that's going to end up backfiring a little bit later. I'm going to go up against the edges and shade away from them. A cross hatch. I want these sections in between to not have like a dark line that's separating them. I really just want you to be able to see those different sections because of the value change. That's a really good thing to kind of get used to. A lot of drawing is more just value changes, difference between contrast, light and dark, rather than having lines outlining everything. And we'll talk about that once we do our little teacup drawing that we're going to be doing next. Before I call this done, I do think it's probably a little bit on the light side. Again, I'd rather it be on the light side than the dark side. I want to try to even it out by going back in and kind of touching back up those areas that I think might be a little bit lighter or a little bit darker in comparison to what's around them. So you do need to kind of have a critical eye. You can't just go through this and just knock it out without really thinking. I want you to have critical thinking as you're looking at this. Okay, so now I've got three values. And what I want you to think about is I want you to think about a ladder. Okay, I want you to think about rungs on a ladder, or like steps, and how steps are even. And as you go along, each one of them should be changing at the exact same rate. Okay, so like if one of those rungs on a ladder is missing and you're having to like really reach or really step up high for the next one, or steps. I don't know if you've ever been on a staircase that has very uneven steps. It's like hard to kind of like get your momentum going without feeling a little unbalanced. We want each of these as we go along to be really balanced and step equally. I can already tell you that this is too light compared to this one. Once I do this, there's going to be a pretty big jump. But what I want you to do is I want you to lay out all of your values 1 through 9 before you go back and make any adjustments. I promise you, once it's all there, it's going to be a lot easier to make adjustments to. Now for this, what I would suggest doing is put down a layer of your H first. And the reason why is because you have those little mountain tops. And we want to fill in deeper down into those little valleys. Okay. You can kind of see with this one, it's kind of fuzzy. And when it's fuzzy, what that's doing is it's really because the graphite didn't, when it went across the paper, it didn't grab into every single one of those little valleys. It just kind of did, maybe every other one. And so what we're doing here is we're laying down a nice flat value first. And I'll show you that I could totally go in with my B pencil. Okay, with my B pencil and start with a B on the other side. Don't lose my line there. Doing it super, super lightly. When you start with a softer pencil, you have a tendency to maybe go a little bit too dark. I don't want you to do this on yours. Okay. I'm just doing this as an explanation that, you know, you're going to end up with the same product either way if you're very careful. I do think that starting with a harder pencil, like an H versus a B, is going to be easier instead. So I laid down B, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to crosshatch that. And you can see what that's doing is it's kind of filling in those kind of speckled white spots just a little bit. Again, when you're working with a lighter value, you're going to see your marks a whole lot more. So it's really important that you're paying really close attention to them. You're being very patient and careful with your mark making. Okay, so I'm going to bring this guy up to that value. Pretty different values right now, but I haven't used my B pencil yet. Again, I'm holding it back. I'm trying to be very, very soft with my mark making. If you remember what this other side looked like, you can maybe see that this side is maybe not quite so speckled. It's just a little bit smoother. It's going to have a different texture in the same way that, like, if you're working with different paintbrushes, those different paintbrushes are going to make different types of marks. Okay, each of those different paintbrushes you need for different reasons, and it's important to know what types of marks they're going to make. So that's another thing that I'm hoping that we're learning here. Just about got it smoothed out. What I'm hoping that you're seeing here is both of them are going to have the same result. I do think that one of them is slightly easier, maybe a little bit more beginner friendly. And as I'm looking at this, there's a huge jump here. These stepped pretty equally. That's a big jump. And I think this one's actually a little bit darker than that one, which is fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go in with my H pencil. And I'm going to try to fill in some of those smaller marks. Stepping a little bit more equally. There's still a big jump here. I'm going to make that adjustment later. Next, we're going to do our darker midtones and our shadows. I'm going to use a 2B and a 4B in particular. We're going to start with a 2B. Again, make sure that you're covering where you're going to be resting your hand. I have a really small pencil, so still, you'll see I'm kind of holding it a little funny. I'm going to start with matching the value that's next to it and then shading away from it. For these last two, oftentimes these can be a little bit tough, not only making them dark enough, but then also making sure that there's enough difference in between them. Again, I suggest starting from the bottom going up, compare it to number 6 and fill in number 7. And then once we get to number 8, you're going to realize that hopefully, at least, you haven't gone so dark that you're already at black. You'll see in just a second. I'm going to start with the 4B and then kind of touch it up with the 6B. You'll notice with these softer pencils that you're going to need to sharpen them more. If you do keep a sharper point on your pencil, you're going to be able to get down into those valleys in between the little mountain tops more easily, and it's going to give you a smoother finish. You'll be able to shade more effectively. So right now, if you look at these, my 8, 7, and really even my 6 all look really super similar. But then there's a huge jump between my 9 and my 8. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start going back in with my 6B pencil, and I'm going to try to get this as close to black without it actually being black as possible. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start evening it out. We were working light to dark, and now we're going to take some of that darkness and we're going to spread it out, and we're going to be really careful to make sure that it's stepping really regularly, just like a staircase or a ladder. They're not looking similar to the neighbor. And for this, you're going to probably need to maybe press a little bit harder. You may need to switch pencils, and I'm going to talk about what pencils to use as you're kind of spreading that darkness back down. For this, I haven't used a 6B yet, and so I'm going to go ahead and start with the 6B here and then see how close I can get it. Big difference. I think this is probably going to be a really good number 7. So I'm going to go ahead and keep going across it, get it just a little bit darker. It's just barely not black. Now there's a huge jump in between these two, and fortunately my 6 and my 7 look really similar, so it's okay. I'm going to switch back to my 4B pencil. And for this, I'm going to really very, very lightly press. I really don't want to make a huge difference. I just want to have a lot of control over my pencil. Something else that you can do is you can kind of step down a little bit further. So this is my 2B pencil, or I could even go in with my B pencil. and it's going to make an even more subtle change than it would with my 4B. So I felt like my 4B wasn't quite getting down into those little valleys, and so I'm going to actually go in with my B pencil and see if I can't kind of touch it back in and get a more subtle change. So as I'm looking at this in its entirety, I think that these are stepping pretty well. I wish you could see the black just a little bit better, but the camera's not picking it up. There's a pretty good difference here. Um, there's a decent difference here. These are maybe a little bit close together. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to start here. I feel like there's a big jump between this 3 and 4. And I'm going to make an adjustment there and then go in with my H pencil to do that. From this point on, it really just kind of depends on what your value scale looks like, what types of adjustments you're going to need to do. Something you can do is you can hold your paper further away from yourself. So maybe have like a friend hold it back and take a couple steps back from you. Um, so you have some space and you'll be able to see those values a little bit more clearly. If you don't feel like doing that, another thing you can do from just your seat is squint at your value scale, and it'll kind of help you see those values that are maybe a little bit too close together. But if you want to go back in, you can always go back in with just kind of your H pencil, and you could go in with your H pencil on any of these to just kind of make a really subtle change. Like if, for instance, if you're seeing too much of that white paper coming through, if your sketchbook has a lot of tooth to its paper, like this one does, um, you may need to use the H pencil to really get down into those little valleys. Remember that there shouldn't be any white halos in between any of the sections. So you want that value to be consistent going all the way across it, all the way out to the edges.